Hello, my name is John Burmeister and welcome to this presentation of Creating a More Inclusive Environment for Your Native American Students. For the last 2 years, I've taught at Fort Lewis College in Durango, Colorado. A relatively distinctive aspect of Fort Lewis College is that 41% of the students who attend the college are Native American or Alaskan Native, representing 177 tribes and Native Alaskan villages. One reason for this high percentage of Native students is that the state of Colorado pays the tuition for all Native students at Fort Lewis, given a historical agreement between the state and the federal government. This tuition waiver is a partial means of fulfilling a debt that is owed based on broader treaty obligations that were made by the federal government in exchange for Native lands across the United States. Teaching a high percentage of Native students for 2 years obviously does not make me an expert in creating inclusive environments for all Native students. However, I do have some first-hand experience with a variety of situations, and I've had additional support from my administration in learning how to more effectively teach my Native students. Another caveat to mention at the outset is that while I do have experience with students from a number of different tribes and Native Alaskan villages, I do not wish to represent what I'm saying here today as representative of all Native students as a monolithic group. Depending on the local context of your institutions, it may make sense to modify some of these suggestions if you know that there's likely to be a large number of students from a particular tradition in your area, but this presentation is intended to give general advice that should help in most contexts. In this presentation, I will discuss 3 suggestions for improving the classroom environment for your Native students. In the first section, I briefly discuss land and/or territory acknowledgements. In all of my classes, I include a land acknowledgement in the syllabus and include a discussion of the acknowledgement on the first day of class. Land acknowledgements are important and can be useful for a number of reasons. First, given the history of treatment of Native peoples on this continent, land acknowledgements are a useful reminder or first introduction that all land on this continent is Native land and to recognize the history of colonialism on the continent. For a useful visual representation of how all land is Native land, the website www.nativeland.ca has an interactive map of the various tribes that have lived on different parts of the North American continent throughout history. A second function of a land acknowledgement is to indicate to your students that you're willing to take seriously issues, viewpoints, and responsibilities related to Native peoples of the continent and to critically examine the influences of colonialism on the land, society, and residents of North America. I've had a number of students who talked to me after the first day of class who were happy that I included a land acknowledgement and felt seen in the classroom. Teaching at Fort Lewis, the college provides a standardized land acknowledgement statement the faculty can use and/or modify as they find useful. However, not all institutions provide such land acknowledgements for their faculty. As a wildly unrepresentative sample, look at the institutions I personally attended as a student. 2 of them, the University of Missouri and Western Michigan University, do not include any land acknowledgements on their websites. And when I taught there as a graduate student in the past, there was no land acknowledgement provided in syllabus information or anywhere else. My undergraduate institution, Central Michigan University, does include land acknowledgements on its website for events and initial welcomes of students to campus, but does not include a statement tailored for the classroom. While this is an unrepresentative sample, it's likely that not all of your institutions will have pre-made land acknowledgements available for your use. If your institution does not have a statement like this, or you cannot find one, it might be worth creating your own short statement to include in your syllabus. The same website that incorporates the interactive map of Native land, native-land.ca, also includes a section on their website for resources for creating your own land acknowledgement. Additionally, there are numerous guides available for creating and understanding land acknowledgements, a few of which I will link below. Before finishing this section of my presentation, I do wish to highlight that there could be some concerns relating to land acknowledgements, including the potential danger that they could make certain individuals think that as long as they include a land acknowledgement, that's all they need to do. So they'll not think that they should also improve or otherwise change their overall behavior with respect to the fact that they're on Native land. The second section of this presentation focuses on the concept of cultural dissonance. Given the likelihood of cultural differences between some Native students' upbringing and the dominant culture of the institution where you teach, there's the possibility that there could be some dissonance between these cultures. At a workshop on culturally responsive teaching I attended while employed at Fort Lewis, the feelings that this dissonance can introduce were referred to as cultural dissonance. And this term, cultural dissonance, as defined by Carolla and Marcelo Suarez-Orozco in their book, Children of Immigration, it's a feeling of discord, conflict, or confusion that people experience when they're in a new, quote, cultural setting but has different expectations of them than they're normally accustomed to. As elaborated on in the workshop, cultural dissonance appears when a person perceives conflicts between a set of, quote, rules from one culture and the, quote, rules of another. Those rules include expectations for how to act, show respect, demonstrate intelligence, demonstrate leadership, seek or provide help, or nearly any other social interaction. Some resources that are useful in applying this concept of cultural dissonance to Native students in the classroom include, first, selections from the book Collected Wisdom, American Indian Education by Linda Miller Cleary and Thomas D. Peacock from 1997. While this book does give examples so that educators can be prepared to recognize behaviors that might be attributable to cultural patterns, it also takes care to indicate that there are wide variations across and within Native American groups and does not stereotype about Native American people, tribes, or communities. Here's one example from Collected Wisdom that highlights the possible friction that cultural dissonance can create, as illustrated by this self-report from a Native American student from the Midwest, Jeb Bailo. He states, "I was brought up in an Indian household with my grandparents and parents, and that's just the way you behaved. I mean, we were seen and not heard. It wasn't polite to show off. In school, I felt really isolated and really alienated and really alone. I just didn't volunteer a lot of information. The Indian way of behaving, you watch, you observe before you act. You don't want to make a fool out of yourself in front of the group because of the shame culture. You observe, and once you know what's expected of you, then you act, but you never want to show off because it's not good taste to pound your own drum." Additionally, a more recent resource on applying the concepts of cultural dissonance to Native students in the classroom is Dr. Stephanie Freiberg's presentation, quote, "Culturally Grounded Academic Interventions That Build on Strengths of Indigenous Students," which can be found on the University of Washington's YouTube page from 2016. Another resource from the workshop I attended at Fort Lewis gave some considerations that were suggested to potentially correct for some of these potential areas of cultural dissonance. First, state your expectations explicitly rather than assuming that good students or students who care will come to see you at office hours or email you. State that it's okay to raise your hands to ask questions, or when it's not okay, how students should address you, and the best way to communicate, and so on. Second, provide opportunities for students to think about the content as individuals or as in small groups before requiring them to answer a question in front of the whole class, especially at the beginning of the term. Furthermore, some students will not want to state a correct answer after a peer has answered it incorrectly because it would be rude to that peer. Use silent think time and writing time when asking questions so that everyone can process content and recall their knowledge. Ask students to share with one or two peers, then call in a few groups to explain their answers. And many of these will help all of your students. Third, remember that many students may believe that they should not make their problems, like confusion about the content, into your problem by taking up your time at office hours. Think about the explicit and implicit messages you send about what it means to meet outside of class. And finally, small statements don't take up much instructional time, but they can make a big difference to students. Overall, there could easily be an entire workshop session just on culturally responsive teaching and attempting to alleviate the tensions of cultural dissonance for your students. But for the sake of time, I will now transition to the last section of this presentation. The last section of this presentation involves acknowledging that the content of some historical philosophical texts can include anti-Native American sentiments and what I do in my classroom in response to this content. Here are some claims that would be included in standard readings in a political philosophy course, especially one with a focus on the history of social contract theory. From Hobbes' Leviathan, chapter 13, "Savage people in many places of America, except for the government of small families, have no government at all," end quote. From Locke's Second Treatise of Government, chapter 5, quote, "For I ask, whether in the wild woods and uncultivated wastes of America, left to nature, without any improvement, tillage, or husbandry, 1,000 acres yield the needy and wretched inhabitants as many conveniences of life as 10 acres equally fertile land do in Devonshire, where they are well cultivated," end quote. From Rousseau's Discourse on the Origin of Inequality, part 1, quote, "It is the more absurd to represent savages as continually cutting one another's throats to indulge their brutality, because this opinion is directly contrary to experience. The Caribbeans, who have as yet least of all deviated from the state of nature, being in fact the most peaceable of people," end quote. And finally, from Mills on liberty, quote, for the same reason we may leave out of consideration those backward states of society in which the race itself may be considered in its nonage or immaturity. Despotism is a legitimate mode of government in dealing with barbarians, provided the end be their improvement and the means justified by actually effecting that end, end quote. How should we respond to these problematic claims? The first step is just to acknowledge that they're problematic claims worth further examination and discussion. The second step is to try to give some historical context to the writer's remarks. Is there evidence that these claims were made because of ignorance of the truth, often about people and situations thousands of miles away? Is there evidence of unconscious prejudice, active and unintentional denigration? Likely the answer will involve multiple factors, and there won't be enough evidence to give one definitive answer. Additionally, you can examine and discuss how these claims might have been used in a way that could affect practical decisions, whether the use was intentional by the author or not. For example, discussing how Locke's claims that there are, quote, uncultivated wastes in America with, quote, wretched inhabitants who don't produce as much as British farmers can, might be used as a justification for British and eventually United States seizure of land from native peoples because the non-natives could be more, quote, efficient with their use of the land. Finally, it can be helpful to include examples that portray Native Americans accurately and to include Native American beliefs and documents in your class, and to highlight implications of philosophical views that involve issues that may be more relevant to your Native students. An example of the first would be including the Haudenosaunee, or Iroquois Great Law of Peace, in a political philosophy course. I first was introduced to this idea from Christopher Buckman's December 2020 article in Teaching Philosophy, including the Iroquois Great Law of Peace in Introduction to Political Philosophy. And I included the document in my course this past semester. One focus that I took with the work was having the class discuss the comparison between the Haudenosaunee's views, as stated implied in the Great Law of Peace, and the early works of the social contract theory tradition, as exemplified by Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau, the sources of some of the aforementioned problematic claims. It obviously was a small sample size of one class in one semester, but I had a majority of my students, native and non-native, indicate that they really appreciated the work's inclusion in our course. Finally, it can be useful to highlight and discuss implications of philosophical views that involve issues that may be more relevant or interesting to native and potentially other historically oppressed students. One potential example could involve including a discussion of whether Nozick's principle of rectification in his entitlement theory would support reparations, especially since he poses the question, quote, how, if at all, do things change if the beneficiaries and those made worse off are not direct parties in the act of injustice, but, for example, their descendants? We have now come to the end of this presentation, and I hope that you might be inspired to include some or all of the things discussed here when designing your future classes. Thank you.